Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Storytelling and Integrated Marketing Communications, the final webinar of our summer series with mStoner's branding partner, BBK. My name is Mallory Wilsey, Director of Marketing and Sales at mStoner, a digital-first creative agency committed to great work, beautiful design, and powerful storytelling. I'm thrilled to introduce today's presenters. Pat McGovern is Vice President of BBK, a Milwaukee-based full-service advertising and brand agency. Pat brings a unique blend of both client and agency experience to the business. Throughout his career, he has worked across a number of verticals with specific focus on higher education. His clients include Florida Tech, Westminster College, St. Cloud State University, and Marquette University. Voltaire Santos Moran is co-founder and co-owner of mStoner. He works with mStoner clients and teams to forge and sustain transformative, memorable, and incredibly effective partnerships. He shapes all aspects of mStoner's individual projects, overall planning, and company-wide management. A natural storyteller, Voltaire enjoys teaching others how to tell stories and using his expertise in information architecture, content strategy, and governance to move institutions from a project mindset to a process mindset. Current clients include McGill University, Northeastern University, and Mills College. Voltaire, I'll turn this session over to you. Let's get started.
So we've got 8 topics that we want to cover. We want to start off with a few incendiary statements, talk about what makes stories so important to us and what makes a good story a story. We want to talk about brand, integrated marketing, baby steps toward a larger vision. We want to share some examples of storytelling in action, and we finally want to conclude with a few lessons that we have learned working with education institutions across the United States and across the country or across the world over the years. But we'd like to start with a question. So if you were to rank your institution's approach to storytelling, how would you rank it? 5 is awesome. We are storytelling gods, and the New York Times has nothing on us. 4, maybe you tell your stories and you strategize well and you coordinate and you measure results. 3, you tell some great stories but could collaborate more. 2, vault all of the profiles, all the happy profiles. And 1, we say we want to tell our story better, but what we actually mean is let's talk about ourselves more and louder.
Looks like the overwhelming majority falls into choice 3, with a handful of folks saying 4 and 5.
That is awesome. All right. Thank you all. And that's really a good backdrop for the statements that we would like to begin this webinar with. So 3 incendiary statements that we want to make. The first is most stories that institutions currently tell aren't really stories. Second statement is that most branding platforms that institutions implement aren't really brands. And the third statement is that most integrated marketing communications plans that institutions launch aren't really integrated. And the fact is that storytelling, branding, and integrated marketing communications, they're all buzzwords in education. And what we're hoping to do today is to provide a framework that allows you to go deeper with each of those tools, to understand them better and use them well. And the foundation of that is to start with story. So let's talk a little bit about why story is so important. Jonathan Gottschalk wrote this really great book called The Storytelling Animal. And one of the things he says is that story teaches us facts about the world. It influences our moral logic. It marks us with fears, hopes, and anxieties that alter our behavior, perhaps even our personalities. I think that most people, when we start to talk about stories, think about stories as a mode of entertainment. But in fact, stories serve many more purposes. In fact, they serve 7 specific purposes in our personal lives and in our lives in community. So in addition to entertaining us, stories also, hold please, help us solve problems. They help us to assimilate into different cultures. They help to impart traditions. They help us to teach people particular concepts. Sorry about the technical glitch, y'all. They help us provide pattern and order, and they help us to connect. Now, I would really love to go into each of these in this webinar, but we won't have time. However, our storytelling series covers each of these ways that story influences us in greater detail. And Mallory will share a little bit more about that with you at the end of the webinar. So Paul Zak, a neuroscientist, goes further and he says a compelling story with an emotional tie alters our brain chemistry and makes us more trusting, understanding, and open to ideas. So if you take a look at what happens with your story on brains, you'll see, or your brain on stories, you'll see that when your mind engages with a story, several things happen. So there's this neural coupling that happens. So the story activates parts in your brain that allow you to translate a story into your own ideas and experience. There's a mirroring effect where listeners experience the same brain activity similar to the storyteller. There is the release of dopamine when someone connects with an idea or a concept emotionally, and it makes it easier to remember with greater accuracy. And stories engage multiple parts of our brain. So Carmine Gallo, who wrote The Storyteller's Secret, talks about the fact that a thought triggers the same regions of the brain that would be activated if you were actually experiencing the event in real life. So when you look at all that, you realize that story is not just for entertaining. Story affects us intellectually, it affects us emotionally, it affects us physiologically, neurologically, and sociologically. And when you realize all of the different ways that story engages us as human beings, you realize that we are wired for story. We respond as human beings to story. And that's what makes story so powerful. So if story is so important, let us then ask the question, what makes a story a story? Now, it's interesting to me that throughout time and across different cultures, a simple and highly effective story pattern has emerged. The way that Aristotle characterized this is 5 different parts of the story: exposition, complication, crisis, climax, and resolution. I like Pixar's version just a little bit better. Once upon a time, one day, because of that, and because of that, until finally. So let's take each of those parts of the story in turn. The very beginning, once upon a time, it's exposition. This is where the setting, the time and the place become clear. This is where the characters and the backstories are identified. And this is where the theme and the plot starts to develop. In the second phase, the complication, one day. Want plus obstacles equals conflict. We're going to talk more about conflict a little bit later in the webinar. The third part of the story, crisis, because of that. There's this progression. There's good, there's bad, there's good, there's bad. And it builds up this sense of tension, which leads right into the climax, the big crescendo. Until finally, realization or transformation, conclusion, and the lesson learned. Because every story has to have an ending. It doesn't have to end happily, but it has to end. Now, there's a lot I'd love to cover in each of these areas or these parts of a story. But again, we cover these more in our storytelling series. So if you are interested in learning more, please take a look at that. For now, what I'd like to do is illustrate these story parts in action. So this is going to be a game. As you recognize the story, chat it out and let's see who gets it first. Once upon a time, a young war veteran takes a job as a bond salesman in New York and rents a small house on Long Island Sound. One day, he's invited to a lavish party thrown by his next-door neighbor, a mysterious millionaire. Because of that, the millionaire and he become friends. Because of that, he becomes entwined in the messy relationships between his cousin and the millionaire, the cousin's husband and his mistress, and the cousin's best friend. Until finally, multiple people die meaningless deaths involving cars, guns, and a well-placed misdirection, and the war veteran flees to the kinder, gentler Midwest. Mallory?
Yes, we have lots of guesses. Neil Robinson, Danielle oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm butchering your last name, and Julie McDonald were the first 3 to ring in right with Great Gatsby.
All right, let's take a look at another example. Once upon a time, a man created a theme park inhabited by uncannily realistic hosts. Something tells me someone just got this. The androids were programmed with the inability to harm humans, giving the guests the chance to enjoy their wildest and darkest fantasies without repercussion. One day, chaos ensues as a software update allows an android to retain memories that should have long been deleted, and because of that, She awakens to her true nature and the nature of the park itself, and because of that, she undertakes a quest to transform herself until a bloody showdown of epic proportions occurs.
Also pretty easily guessed. Brian Byrne, I appreciate what you threw out there, but Tracy, Ash, and Donna were our first three to ring incorrect with dun 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 Westworld.
Can I tell you how hard it was to write that description without giving spoilers to exactly what happens?
Right?
Right? All right, here's one last one. Once upon a time, there was a young woman in love with a young man. One day, she found out he was making a play for another girl at a local bar. Because of that, she decided to take reprisal while he was shooting pool and drinking fancy cocktails. Because of that, she reduced his most prized possession, his truck, to a useless immobile pile of leather, glass, and steel, until finally her rage sated by the cathartic experience, she congratulated herself for doing his next girlfriend a service, and she resolved to date higher quality men.
This might be my favorite example of Voltaire, and we had people get it right. I thought this was the toughest one, but Julie and Heather both correctly identified that this is a Carrie Underwood song.
Yes, her breakaway hit Before He Cheats. So take a look at that. What you see is that we've used an example from the great, we've talked about the Great American Novel. We referred to a current sci-fi series. We looked at a country music song from 2004. And these are such different things, different genres, different times. And yet what we see is that the same story pattern serves all of the stories. The reason we wanted to share this is that great storytelling for education follows great principles of storytelling, period. And that is a great segue into Pat talking about values-based branding. A lot of times people ask us, what stories should we tell? And Pat has the answer.
Vol, thanks. And I'm so excited to be here for this webinar, because this is I just think it's such seminal work, and it's so important nowadays. Why? There's so many messages out there, guys, right? How do you break through? And doing, there's only a few great Gatsbys. There's only a few things that really connect and really do break through. And there's a lot of just ho-hum stuff out there. I don't know if I'm going to give you all the answers. I know I'm not, but I'm going to give you some direction on where to start. And what we like to do is focus our efforts on values and values-based branding, right? Basically, guys, the best stories to tell are the ones that are anchored to your brand and focused on your customer. Let me just hang on that for a moment, okay? Anchored to your brand, but focused on your customer. Sadly, this doesn't always happen. As you'll see, people and marketers, especially in higher ed, want to talk a lot about themselves. There is no doubt there's a sea of sameness going on there. These are some of the lines that you see time and time again. The ideal location, great campus, strong and loyal network of alumni, interdisciplinary approach to learning, the start of a rewarding long career. All great, but it's always talking about the same thing. And it's really talking about us first, how do we connect more with our customer, right? How do we connect more with that senior and even maybe that sophomore, right, coming out of high school? We have to flip it around and we have to start thinking about it. And what we do is we like to anchor that in value. Next slide, please. This is a great quote from the Schultzes in their book. Over the years, it has become clear that people relate to brands, not to the various forms of marketing or marketing communication. Relate to brands. Not only is this a great quote, because I firmly and we firmly believe that here at BVK and mStoner, but beyond that, there's research, especially with Gen Y and Gen Z, that's saying this. They are selecting brands and want to work with brands that really are a reflection of themselves. So they're taking brand to a whole new level. It's not just, I'm buying this product because I like it. It's saying something exactly about me. That's a whole different paradigm than it was when I was growing up. So that connection and that relationship with brands becomes increasingly more important as we go on as marketers. What our role is now is to find that section point, right? That intersection of what we offer and what the brand offers to really connect there. And that intersection is really at values. And what are values? Well, our values trigger our most powerful emotions that become and reflect the fundamental choices of who we are and who we want to be. If we think about a value is what we believe in the world, what I stand for, what I believe in, and what I don't believe in. Now, if I'm a brand and I could connect to you on some of those values, think of the power now for storytelling, right? One, I'm connected with you, so you have an interest in what I'm about to say. And if we have this mutual value, now it opens up all kinds of possibilities. So as marketers, what our job is now is simple, just finding that one core human value, right? What's that one thing that's going to stand out? Because when we find that, it's to leverage that, and its positioning will give your brand clarity, focus, and meaning, right? So as we begin telling stories, we want to understand where we're at. What is going to be the root of what all of our stories are going to emerge from, right? So when we start talking about values, there's quite a few values. In fact, there's about 500, there may be over 500 at this point. And they run the gamut. This is not something that BVK or mStoner has developed. This was a list that has begun in the 50s. As you can see, it's rooted in both academic and clinical research. Psychologists, anthropologists, social workers have all added to this list of values. While there's 500 out there, what we found in our experience is that it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 to maybe about 125 that most universities, most higher ed institutions kind of fall within that same area, right? So again, it's finding that value that resonates with your consumer. Okay, this is a slide that we use quite a bit when we're talking about value-based positioning, because it's simple in its complexity, or should I say execution. You have an audience, personal values. They stand for something. They have these fundamental beliefs. My brand also has some core values. Finding that sweet spot there begins a foundation for meaningful and lasting relationship. And the process to go through that requires both a left brain and right brain, right? You have to understand, you have to do your research in order to get to it. But there's also the point of understanding experiences, understanding certain factors, filtering certain things out. So as we're putting this together, you have to both employ some hardcore analytics, but also more of the art and creativity, allowing for expression to find that sweet spot.
Good deal. Thank you, Pat. So let me talk a little bit about integrated marketing communications, and let's start with the definition. Integrated marketing is a customer-centric approach to creating a unified and seamless experience for individuals to interact with an institution. IMC attempts to meld all aspects of marketing communication so they all work together as a unified force. It is a process designed to ensure that all messaging and communication strategies are consistent across all channels and centered on your audiences. So I highlighted the 4 phrases or words that are most important in this definition. First, customer-centric approach. Going back to what Pat was saying just a little bit earlier, marketing is not about pushing out messages about who we are and hoping people will listen. Marketing now is about understanding and developing empathy for the people that you are trying to reach. That is a core principle of integrated marketing communications. A second core principle is that it is unified and seamless. So the idea is that across all of the different ways that you reach people, your message, your values, everything that you're communicating dovetails not only in promise, but actually in experience. The third core concept is this idea of process. IMC is not just a campaign, it is an ongoing process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that process in a bit, of strategic planning out your communications, measuring your communications, and then basing new decisions on that data. And then finally, the last concept, this idea of consistency. So integrated marketing strives to provide the consistency of messaging, the consistency of experience across all touch points. Now, the tools that are at our disposal with integrated marketing are they span both high touch and high tech. We've got institutional websites, social media channels, digital advertising. email communications, text, personal interactions, printed materials, public relations activities, and traditional advertising. And since IMC first came on the scene in the 80s, it has evolved. So some changes that we're seeing in the way that people are approaching integrated marketing communications in 2018. First, there's the shift away from this idea of the 4 Ps. So price, promotion, product, and what's the last one of those? There are 4 Ps, they're no longer relevant. What's relevant now is the experience and the interaction with the brand. The second thing that we're seeing in IMC is that the sheer amount of data and technology that we have and our easy access to it makes it easier for us to communicate to people on an individual basis and to know more about them now more than ever before. The third trend in IMC is this measurement and accountability. Analytics gives us great visibility to the effectiveness of our communications, so we no longer have to guess. We no longer have marketing abstracted from any sorts of goals or accountability. It's all built into the process. And then finally, technology and digital first, and simply put, digital leads. Now, you take a look at these trends and you realize why it is that education has not embraced integrated marketing communications in a holistic or a consistent way. Because we as human beings are wired for story, but honestly, institutions are not wired for IMC. We talk about collaboration, but doesn't it sometimes feel like working in a university is more like being in Game of Thrones? So we've labeled here the houses of the 5 A's: athletics, admissions, advancement, academics, and alumni. So let's talk about those barriers. So some of the barriers that we see in higher education. Number one, this idea of strongholds and silos. Different areas of institutions tend to function independently with very little conversation or collaboration between the units. There's a lack of alignment. If you haven't gone through the process of defining your brand, then how are people supposed to know how to talk about you? The lack of systems is also a problem. Institutions that don't have a way to collect data, analyze information, and deploy communications in an enterprise type fashion are going to be hamstrung. And finally, there's this lack of understanding about how IMC is supposed to work. At its best, it incorporates high touch and high tech in all interactions across the institution. So we're not talking just admissions to registrar. We're talking admissions to registrar, to student life, to career services, to alumni relations. We're talking about every part of the institution becoming, or every person within the institution becoming a brand ambassador for the institution. We're talking about every single point of communication really tying back to your brand and your goals as an institution. It requires that marketing will have a seat at the table for planning, for strategy, and it requires a new approach to the budgeting process. So we can see the barriers, but what are the benefits? The benefits are better everything, right? At least theoretically, we would have a better experience for our audience. We would have stronger brand perceptions. We would have more loyalty and brand trust, efficient communications, and more return on investment. So let me lay out our philosophy at BBK and mStoner about storytelling, brand, and IMC. Branding is storytelling, storytelling is brand. IMC is the process through which your stories reach your audiences. So let's cover the steps involved in all this. So 6 steps involved in building your brand ideal. I'm going to have to whiz through this, but if you're interested in taking a deeper dive, our previous webinar, Brand Architecture, that Tam and I presented at, will be available to you all. You can check that out. But here are the 6 stages of building a brand ideal. There's the discovery stage where you figure out your brand value, where you then clarify your position and you make sure that it is unique, it is ownable, it is sustainable. There's the 3rd step of inspiring, and this is because brands need to be embraced from the inside out. The brand projects that are doomed to fail are the brand projects that are launched without any effort being given to internal socialization and excitement and buy-in. So that's essential. 4th step is aligning, integrating actions from the inside out, then engaging with all of your audiences and creating meaningful experiences. And that becomes that final step where all hell breaks loose in a really, really good way and your brand gets transformed. So 6 steps in building your brand ideal. Once the brand is articulated, then we move into the integrated marketing communications planning process. So there are 5 steps here. There's the identification of your customers and your prospects. There's evaluation where you figure out exactly what each prospect and customer is worth in terms of inflow to the institution. There's the planning process in which you identify the communications messages, the incentives, and the plan around what it is that you are going to be sharing with your prospects and your customers. There is the estimation of the return of the investment. And then there is finally, once a campaign is done, post-program analysis and future planning. So again, this ties back to what we talked about a little bit ago, where analytics and accountability are really built into, they have to be built into IMC for IMC to work. The last process I want to show you is the 5 steps in developing a digital story. So when you're doing a story, you start with strategy. What's the story? Why are you telling the story? To who are you telling the story? And what are you going to measure? There is the production of the story where you create all of the assets and all of the elements that are going to be pushed out across all channels. And then there's publish, there's go live. I love the fact that publish is smack dab in the middle of the process, because one of the things we've learned about digital storytelling is the story's life begins when you press publish. Now, I grew up doing print. So for me, when I was early on in my career, we would get an alumni magazine out and we would all be thrilled because it was done. Right? There was nothing left to do. It had gone to the printers. It was going to be mailed to the alumni. Let's go celebrate. But in digital storytelling, the moment that story goes live is the moment that the hard work continues. So there's that promotion of that story over time, over the different channels. Mm-hmm. And then there's finally the assessment. What worked, what didn't, what risks paid off, and then what are you going to do differently as a result? You mash all of these processes together. This is what it looks like. So the brand process begins, but so does story identification, because I can promise you, when you are looking for that core value upon which to build your brand, one of the ways that we're going to figure out what that core value is when you start telling stories about people. It could be a faculty member. It could be a student. It could be an alum. But those stories of those people who represent the institution, the ethos of the institution, why the institution exists, those stories become very, very clear at the very beginning of the brand. Once the brand process, which usually takes about 6 months, is finished, then you go into the integrated marketing communication planning process. And story is there as well. Because as you were taking a look at what it is that you were going to share messaging-wise, those stories that you identified back when you were building your brand come back. And that's when you start to collect and build those stories. You produce them, you take them live, and then, as any good process has, there's analysis and future planning. So in this sort of vision, brand to IMC to storytelling and analysis and planning for the future takes roughly a year. And there are probably people within the webinar who are saying, wow, that looks beautiful. We're nowhere near that. We're years away from being able to do a brand project, or we just did a brand project, but we don't really have the infrastructure for IMC, but we want to tell more stories. So let me offer a couple of baby steps. So the first is to tell stories better, to tell stories more strategically. You need your team at the table at the very beginning. So a core storytelling team has these roles. I'm not saying that you have to have one person assigned to each role, but you have to have these roles covered. There's the role of marketing strategy. There's the role of editor and writer, designer, photographer, developer, social media manager, and analytics specialist. And all of these people need to be at the table at the very beginning, because if you wait until the day before a story is supposed to go live, and this has happened to me back in our print days, and then you call the photography team and say, hey, I need a picture for this story. What have you got in the archives? You have done your story a disservice. Or if you launch your story and then you call the analytics specialist and say, what can you tell me? And the analytics specialist has not been able to build in the sort of tracking that can tell you how long someone played a video, how long someone interacted with an interactive timeline, then you've just lost some really great data. So the first thing to do is get the entire team together and collaboratively plan this story out. The second is to ask all the crucial questions at the very beginning. I don't know if y'all are big fans of Anne Handley. If you're not, you should be. She's amazing. I actually love Sundays all the better for the Sundays where I get her newsletter. But this conceptual planning questionnaire is inspired by her book, Everybody Writes, Your Go-To Guide for Creating a Ridiculously Good Content. And the questions that you should be asking as you are writing, you're strategizing your story is, why is this story important? And who am I writing it for? What do you want to do or learn? Are you putting in a part of your story? We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about lessons learned. What part of the user experience or journey am I supporting? That means you have to have a little bit of a knowledge about what that user experience or what that journey is. And that ties back to building empathy and taking a customer-centric approach. What do I want my audiences to do as a result? What's the narrative arc? What's the conflict or tension in the story? How will I measure? What risks will I take? And how do I bring the story to life with the resources that I have access to? So what we'd like to do now is show you 3 very different examples of storytelling in action to give you a sense of how all this can come together. Okay. Once upon a time, there was a company that opened its doors on Black Friday like every other retailer. One day they decided the idea of being indoors that day was soul crushing. So it decided to opt outside, and it decided to invite the world to join. The word spread, the call resonated, until finally on Black Friday, a new movement was born. Mallory, can anyone identify the company?
REI, Ellen and Ash, Benson and Laura all quickly responded with that. It sounds like we have some REI fans here.
Yeah, this was amazing. I remember when I heard about this campaign 2015, and this is a great example of how they had all of their stuff together for this. So here's the Twitter page that talked about the fact that they were closing on Black Friday. Here's the website that they put together. And then here's the email that I got in my email box. Here's the video that they took onto YouTube. Here's the campaign that they produced on Instagram. Really an incredible way of telling their story, but more importantly, inviting everyone into their story. So part of the magic of this campaign is it was no longer REI's story. It was our story together. And our story is anyone who looked at this and said, hell yeah, I'm opting outside. It did so well that in the next year, they created a follow-up campaign, Will You Go Out With Me? And then they enabled interaction and idea exchange online. Now, what's fascinating is you take a look at the results here, right? So 6.7 billion media impressions, 1.2 billion social impressions. Here's where it matters. 1.4 million spent the day outdoors. 150 additional companies joined REI. Hundreds of state parks opened up for free. Wow. And 99% increase in retail applications, 9.3% increase in revenue. I mean, across all of the different ways you could want to measure this in terms of people being engaged, in terms of awareness of the campaign, in terms of translation into bottom line dollars. They did it, and they did it really well. Here's a different example. And this example comes from Bowdoin. Once upon a time, there was an archaeologist at Bowdoin. One day she realized her life's work was in danger of being lost very soon to the sea, a casualty of climate change. Because of that, she sought college support and national funding for an expedition to excavate and gather as much as possible. Because of that, she traveled to Greenland, an inhospitable and isolated land, in this race against time to save what she could from destruction. Until finally, she returned to Bowdoin with a trove of artifacts and information that could finally unlock the mystery of 2 lost civilizations. The story was called A Race to Save the Artifacts. And what was really fantastic about this, it was one of Bowdoin's first attempts at collaborative storytelling across several departments. And so if you Google A Race to Save the Artifacts, you'll find it easily. And this project involved producing a digital story with high impact photography, videos, infographics, interactive elements. It included the development of a media plan, partner outreach, and social campaigns to support and to promote the story over time. And the goals that Bowdoin had when they did this, they wanted to raise awareness of teaching and the study of the environment, raise awareness of research and faculty expertise in the Arctic, because they have a very specific commitment to the Arctic and environmentalism, raising the awareness of the impact of climate change and highlighting opportunities for student engagement and faculty research. The measurement was based on those goals. So they wanted to find out, they set a goal, an arbitrary goal of how many people, how many page views they would get. They set it for 3,000, they actually got 4,500. In terms of engagement with the story, they wanted to make sure that 70% got 50% the way through it, and maybe half of the people who read it actually read to the end. The numbers were better than that. Site engagement, as measured by at least 3 minutes average on duration for the site, that was about what they expected, and it's about what they got. And pickups by 5 other non-Bowdoin orgs and media outlets, they surpassed that, including the National Science Foundation picking it up and running it. So this is a very, very different example from REI, but it's an example of what I would call the baby steps, where this wasn't tied into a branding exercise. It wasn't tied into an integrated marketing communications plan. This was simply a team saying, we want to tell better stories together. So let's start somewhere, and let's learn, and let's continue. All right. I would love, Pat, to talk about Michigan State.
Yeah, thanks, Volt. And I just want to reflect back on the 2 case studies and examples that you showed. What I think is fascinating about them is they're great examples. I mean, that REI one could be just a whole webinar in and of itself. But again, those resonate to me as I'm looking at those because they're true to that brand, right? Bowdoin, that seems like something they would do. REI, yeah, that fits into their whole core, their whole narrative, what they're all about. And this example kind of feeds into that same theme. So I'm not going to go through all the history of Michigan State and the work we have done here, but what happened is when we got there, fast forward, Spartan's Will was in place. We set that up and we launched that and people were excited about it. And we hit upon that. We did our research, we did everything, we got to this place. The next step though was really saying, okay, we have this. To the points we talked about earlier, how do we get this out there? We have to be integrated about this whole thing. We have to leverage as much as we can. Michigan State's a big school. It's a prominent school. They probably have a war chest bigger than many, but still it's relatively small. So they have to use every channel at their disposal to maximize their storytelling and maximize their integration across all channels. So we'll go to the next slide, please.
Sure.
So this is what we put together for them to just kind of visualize, not only to help them, but to help us too. Think about all the different touch points that are out there for the university and how we can maximize telling our story across all of these, right? Volt spent a lot of time earlier talking about that integrated idea. Well, once we hit the story, Spartan's Will, right? We had to maximize that across all the channels. And what's also interesting too, and keep this in mind, guys, it's not the exact same story across all channels. It's understanding and using all those channels, but using them as effectively as possible, right? Especially in social, when we're, each one of those channels is a little bit different. And so the messaging needs to be nuanced ever so slightly to make the biggest kind of impact. So as we began to think about, all right, we have our platform in place. How do we get this out? What are we talking about? This is what we kind of had to keep in mind. The website is the core, but certainly there's other opportunities. I don't know if there's a lot of people out there thinking, yeah, I've got a lot of stories, and MSU was certainly one of them. Yeah, we got a lot of stories. The issue was, well, where are they? Oh, well, this person's got a really compelling story. Oh, you know who you should talk to? this professor is doing unbelievable work. Oh, okay. Oh, and you know, oh, and over in this college, this person is doing amazing things. Yeah, but where are their stories? We don't have them. I mean, they're there, but they're not there. So part of just storytelling is kind of bringing everybody together, really leveraging what you have. We created MSU Today, and instead of telling one story, we tried to tell a lot of stories, all fitting back into who will? Spartans will. The whole idea here is we're taking on problems the world is facing. That might be bringing healthcare to Africa. It might mean helping kids drink clean water in Flint. But who's going to take that on? So our idea was, let's bring this all together. Let's create a place where that story can be told. And let's keep updating this, because these stories, need to be rotated. There's other things happening as time goes on. So MSU Today was the vehicle and the place where we drove people to this. Now, the idea here was not, let's drive enrollments. That wasn't the core on this thing. The results here was, how do we get better engagement, particularly with alumni? And after we launched this, alumni engagement went up 34% the first year that they launched this. This has been one of those activities, one of these projects that has really resonated well. And I think it fits into well what we're talking about, because again, these are things that I'm guessing many of you already have out there. It's just a matter now of thinking about it, bringing this all together, and now using this in different ways. So one point I do want to hit on is, as we captured these stories did not only live here on video, that in the page that Volt just showed you a moment ago, but they were used in that ecosystem throughout different areas. We might have used them on social. We might have pushed this into airport advertising. We might have pushed this onto a billboard, depending on the kind of situation, depending on the circumstance. But that's how we used all this.
Awesome. Thank you, Pat. So let's wrap up the webinar and open up for questions. So 3 lessons that we've learned over time. First lesson is, your institution is not the hero of your story. Let's just pause there for a second. Your institution is not the hero of your story. Your institution is the Yoda of the hero of the story, but not the hero of the story. And I think REI did a really nice job with this. So here's something from their site. The way they frame it is brilliant. Opt Outside is not just about Black Friday. It's a mindset. It's about choosing life outdoors, and it has become a way for people to share who they are and what they believe in. And so the hero of the story is not REI. The hero of the story is everyone who is committed to taking care of our world and to enjoying our world. The second lesson that we've learned, no conflict, no story. Get a lot of questions from people about, well, what's the difference? How do I find a story? What's the difference between a profile and a story? And I had this really great example, one team that I was working with, where we just decided to dive in for a little while. So you work on a profile. Profile has what? Name, hometown, major and graduation year, extracurricular activities, sports, career goals, favorite places on campus. It's really nice. It kind of reminds me of those jurors ads that they used to do in the 80s, or the post questionnaires from Vanity Fair. And it's a nice little snippet into a person. But we talked about this one person they did a profile on, and we drilled down a little bit more, and we asked, all right, what was this person's story? And we found out that he came to play baseball and study pre-med. He wanted to become a surgeon, and he wanted to play sports. So everything was going along really, really well until his first course in college, where he saw blood for the first time and fainted in class. And the professor tried everything the professor could to help give that guy's dream a fighting chance. And the story was about that process and about how he found a new path when his initial dream died. So that's the difference between a profile and a story. A profile gives you a glimmer. A story gives you an emotional connection into someone's life. And then the third lesson, story first, department second. And I love this because a lot of times when we work with clients, they say, well, you know what, we just don't have the skill sets. And what we find out is that the skill sets exist. The problem is that they don't exist in your department sometimes, or in the departments that you have friendly relations with. Back to the houses of the 5 A's and the Game of Thrones example. And sometimes the institution needs to shift a little in order to allow different areas to collaborate better. So a writer from one area can work with a photographer and a videographer and then someone from IT in order to pull stories together that serve the entire institution well. And so we end with one of my favorite quotes, not just because I wrote it. The best stories in higher education are the ones we learn to tell together. All right, so Mallory, let's turn this over to you. What's next?
Terrific. Thank you so much, Voltaire and Pat, for an awesome, interactive, and inspiring webinar. A friendly reminder, attendees, please don't forget to fill out our quick webinar survey. It'll take you about 3 minutes, and I'll be chatting a link to that in the chat room. You'll also get an email follow-up after this webinar concludes with a link. We really appreciate your time and your feedback. I also want to share 3 additional resources with you, and I will post the links to each in the chat room. And we'll post them on Twitter shortly as well. So today's webinar was actually the final session of our 3-part summer webinar series with BBK. This summer, we've explored how to build an enduring brand with a values-based approach and how to gain buy-in from senior leaders for a brand to web project. If you missed either of the previous sessions, they are available on demand, and I'll share that link in a moment. Another great professional development resource for your entire team is mStoner's on-demand digital storytelling course that Voltaire mentioned a little earlier today. The course is comprised of 8 classes, which total 5 hours of content, and it covers everything from accessibility and visual design for digital stories to storytelling strategies for specific audiences like prospective students and donors. So anyone on your team can access this course and work through it at their own pace because everything is on demand. We're also extending a special $100 discount to everybody who is attending today with the promo code Summer Series. And finally, if something you heard today has piqued your interest and you want to brainstorm or talk more, just get in touch with me. I'd love to hop on the phone and discuss your challenges or simply just bounce ideas around for better storytelling and IMC. So I'm going to also share a link that'll give you some options for getting in touch, but you're also welcome to just simply shoot me an email to kick off the conversation as well. All right, let's move into Q&A. I have captured a number of questions from folks. And so, I'll start here. We have some attendees who work in admissions or in enrollment marketing positions. And I think that, certainly understanding storytelling is one thing, but actually applying it to admission priorities and, where is the conflict when you're talking about storytelling that's really going to resonate with prospective students? Voltaire, can I toss that one over to you?
Yeah, I think that it's a lot of the stories that we see that do well with prospective students are stories that allow them to imagine themselves as a student and imagine their futures, right? So stories where people are alumni, and what we found in our research is that prospective students love stories of alumni who have been out in the workforce for 10 years or fewer, or have been out in the workforce for 30 years or more. The reason being they like to see what their career is going to be like beforehand, and they want to see what their career will be like when they're further out. So when we look at different stories that are going to matter to those prospective students, I think of stories of people who, for instance, how about a first-generation student, an alum who is telling a story about how the first 3 weeks or the first 3 months sucked because they had no idea what they were doing and how did they find their way. So they're stories with a level of authenticity and stories that show how people have dealt with certain issues. So there are stories about first-generation students learning how to become a college student because they had no one else to lead the way for them. There are stories, for instance, of someone who came thinking they were going to do one thing and they ended up having to do or wanting to do another. So, I think a lot of times when we talk about conflict, the word conjures up ideas of an actual fight in our heads. There's some sort of big clash. And the big clash does not necessarily need to be with an external force. Sometimes the clash is with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So finding those stories where people are telling about their experience and how they managed and how they made it through, I think are really compelling for prospective students, particularly when you've got students who are saying, I'm not sure how to navigate all this, or I'm not sure I'm going to be successful. Let's give them stories that show them they can be.
Pat, what would you add?
That's just a really great point. So it's not too much on that, but I think Volt, you hit on it. The idea of finding out, I guess, here's what I would say to that is, where is the person struggling? What is their conflict? So most of the time it's going to be, can I do this? Right? So give me that example of how other people have overcome this. It might be, I don't know what direction I'm going. I'm here at college, and that's that kind of conflict. And I think as admissions people, because they're dealing with students so much, that's a wonderful setting to collect stories that they could reuse again and again and again, and make that very powerful when they're dealing with other people. Going, you know what? There was someone who was sitting in that exact same chair 2 years ago. Let me tell you about that person. Those things just resonate. Not only do they resonate, they show a pathway of other people who've gone before you. So,
Mallory, one other thing that I would add, as Pat was talking, made me realize we've done an entire webinar on storytelling for recruitment and retention. And that webinar actually ties the types of stories you tell to the phase of the journey. Perfect. So there are four stages to the admissions process or the complex sale. And we have in that webinar examples of stories that really meet the needs and the emotions that people are going through in each of those phases.
Yeah, and that session is part of the digital storytelling course, in fact. So great. Okay, Pat, a question for you. One of the folks in the chat room asked, what if your institution's core human value is also very similar to many others, and perhaps even many of the institutions you might compete with for prospective students? And the example that was offered was make the world a better place.
Well, that's a really good question. You're dealing with a relatively finite universe, as I said. So within the higher ed space, you're kind of swimming in a kind of a similar type of feeling and value base that you're drawing from. That said, I think there's a lot of areas where you could still explore, and not. The idea here is to break out. The idea here is to differentiate yourselves from another school. The comment, Mallory, can you read that again to me?
Yeah, it was make the world a better place.
So making the world a better place really isn't a value. It's more of a tag. I would want to go back in and understand what that value, I think there's more room to explore what that could be and define that. But that in and of itself is not there. For our standpoint, we try to differentiate it as much as we can. Can two schools have something similar? Yeah, that's possible. They could be in the kind of a similar type of space. It's up to their marketing team, both internal and external, then to differentiate. And how do you separate yourself? Again, that's the point here. What do we do well? And this is our value, and this is what we're all about. And what you're trying to do is leverage that as fully as possible to differentiate yourself from every other school there. So if your value is kind of similar, then you have to look at other ways in which to create differences.
Great, thank you. This question I really appreciated. It also came from our chat room. Can an educational institution create a unified and seamless experience without a centralized marketing team? The comment was, this seems like it would be very difficult due to the highly siloed nature of most institutions. Voltaire, what do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's, as we said a little bit earlier, it's, institutions are not wired to do this. And to be honest, when you take a look at the way that IMC started, you know, you and I know, Mallory, that integrated marketing communications was actually a pragmatic move made by agencies in order to capture more revenue by saying you should run everything, you should have everything streamlined, and we do everything. So you should run everything through us. So the model itself was based on a very pragmatic, agency-focused approach to corporate sales. That is very, very different from the experience that we are offering and the approach that we take as an education institution. So I think that there are ways to become better and more integrated in marketing communications over time. And I think that what I've seen is the best examples have come from conversations that become collaborations that then become commitments to the teams, you know, the people within the teams that you're working with. That to me has been the most organic way that integrated marketing communications happens. But I have yet to see a school or a university that has taken IMC to the level that a Starbucks or a Disney World has done.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Can it be done? Yeah, it can be done. I would not recommend it. And I just think in today's day and age where it is a 24/7 cycle and things are moving at breakneck pace, the amount of friction that you can reduce and the amount of drag that you can reduce in order to move things faster, quicker, better, that's the way you should go. In a decentralized way just doesn't naturally allow for that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Okay, Voltaire, another storytelling focused question.
Sure.
We had a few folks comment in the chat room when you pulled up the storytelling team. In some cases, there is maybe only one or two people who essentially have to wear all of the different hats and do all those different roles for their institution. So what would you say is, you know, maybe the most crucial one or two things to get right when you have a small staff?
That is a great question. Thank you for asking it. And we actually have a presentation on like different levels of teams, like the core storytelling team. I call the core storytelling team the dynamic duo, because there are a number of institutions who only have like two people who are doing everything. Right. And then there is this larger core storytelling team. And then there's this mature core storytelling team that has like 25 people. And every time I put up that slide, I get yelled at by attendees who are like, who has that? And I'm like, Boston. So it does happen. But all right, the question is, what do you have to get right? Really great content, really great photography. If all you have are two people, then focus on high impact photography and a really great narrative, and make sure that that really great narrative is chunkable, basically, that you've got quotes that you can tweet out, that you can basically take pieces of this and multi-use it so that you get a lot of value.
Yeah.
Exactly, mileage. Thank you, Pat, for all the investment that you make. But that's what I would focus on first. Now, anyone who has 25 people on their team and wants to know what you should be aiming for, text me, hit me up. I've got opinions.
Awesome. Well, that is about it as far as Q&A goes. I see we're just over the top of the hour. So thank you so much for everyone who stuck around to get through Q&A with us. Don't forget to fill out that short survey a little later today, and have a wonderful afternoon. We so look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks for being with us today, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.